Welcome to the Linden Hills History Study Group's virtual event. Tonight's program is on the history of the lost Japanese gardens of John Scott Bradstreet with Kathy Kullberg. The online Minnesota encyclopedia, Minneapolis, called John Bradstreet a key tastemaker in early 20th century Minnesota. That indeed is what I know him for. As a designer and collector of objects and interiors, Bradstreet shaped the aesthetic tastes and parlors of the Twin Cities. Perhaps some of you, like me, were unaware of his influence on local garden design and landscape. One of his most notable gardens was located right here in Linden Hills. Kathy Kullberg, in her business, If Your Walls Could Talk, has been working as a house history detective for 12 years, researching for clients the architecture and house history of homes and structures. She has taught classes and led many tours, including one focused on Maud Hart Lovelace. Her house history has focused on the first quarter of the 20th century. She has given walking tours, including for Preserve Minneapolis. Just this month, she led a walking tour of Architect Avenue. Kathy has also shared on Preserve Minneapolis's website, Minneapolis Historical. Her searchable neighborhood spreadsheets on buildings and structures in the Kingfield, Bryn Mawr, Tangletown, Cedar Lake Park, and Shenandoah Terrace, which is a subdivision of the Northrop neighborhood. The spreadsheets include addresses, year built, names of first owners, the builder, architect, a very impressive resource available to all of us. Kathy currently is working on a book about John Bradstreet. From my cursory search, I did not find a book dedicated to him, so this would be a great addition to our local history. Kathy, take it away.
Good evening. This is Kathy Kullberg, and I'm going to talk to you about my research that I've been doing to discover the lost Japanese gardens that John Scott Bradstreet built here in Minnesota. And he was here from Minnesota from 1873 to 1914. But he was born in Rowley, Massachusetts in 1845. He was the son of a shoe cutter, one of 4 children, and that part of Massachusetts was really well known for its manufacturing and textiles, hence the shoe cutter influence of his father. He attended the highly regarded Putnam School, which was south of Boston at the time, and after he graduated, he found himself in Providence, Rhode Island, working at the famous Gorham Silver Company, where he was employed mostly as a clerk and later as a salary clerk till about 1873 when he moved to Minnesota. It was probably at that point that he met with Dexter Thurber, who was the son of Gorham Thurber, who was the grandson of the founder of the Silver Gorham factory. He came to Minneapolis about 1873, and we're not exactly sure why, but we think it was for his health. There are indications that he might have had tuberculosis or he might have suffered from asthma. And when he first came in 1873, there really weren't any hotels for him to stay in, so people actually stayed in rooming houses. And by 1885, we find him living and taking rooms in the William Sheldon Judd House, which was one of the exclusive mansions that was downtown Minneapolis. The family, in order to make things work for them, often rented out rooms to visiting high society people who were coming to town. But because Bradstreet traveled so much, he took his rooms and he was a long-term resident there, and he was allowed to change as much as he could. This house was located about 5th Street, right in the heart of downtown, and there were 2 houses that looked similar. This house actually took up the entire block. By 1925, though, the house had fallen into disrepair because the family had, Mr. Judd had died, and then the family had sold it became the property of the city of Minneapolis. Because it was a whole city block, they started using the grounds around the building for parking. So the cars that you see in this picture in the 1920s are because it was one of those abandoned city lots that was being used for parking. It did take quite a lot to tear it down in the 1920s. There was speculation as to who should take this lot at the time, and it was the city of Minneapolis really wanted to put their new city hospital here. But by 1931, it was determined that we would be better served if we had a new armory. So the Minneapolis Armory that has been recently restored is now located on the same site of what was the Judd House. While he was actually living at the Judd House, he had free rein to do what he wanted to do. And so in this painting, which is now at MIA, Minneapolis Institute of Arts, done by Douglas Volk in 1890, this is showing Mr. Bradstreet in his rooms, which are like over the top. We know he was the leading interior decorator of the time, especially in the upper Midwest. He was sought after by all the high society, and he traveled extensively in order to bring and import things into the Twin Cities that he would sell. He even had a window given to him reportedly by Louis Comfort Tiffany that he had installed in his rooms at the Judd House. Now, when he left the Judd House, we're not sure if he actually took the window with him, he put it into a new house that he built, which he didn't live in, or where that window actually is at this point in time. But it was part of his estate. Bradstreet traveled extensively. He went both to Europe and Asia on many buying trips. Even several times he went to Bermuda. First, he started a business working for other people, and then in 1878, he teamed up with Edmund Phelps, and they had a company that they called Bradstreet and Phelps that ran from 1878 to 1884. At this time, he was busy traveling and bringing back all kinds of goods and supplies to sell in the store. He reportedly didn't like the high Victorian style that was going on. He was more leading into what was up and coming, and so he preferred the East Lake style at this time. This was also the very, very beginnings of the arts and crafts movement, and he was bringing some of those things back into his estate to sell them. By 1884, Edmund Phelps had decided he wanted to go into investment banking. So he and Bradstreet separated ways, and then Bradstreet teamed up with Thurber, which was Dexter Thurber from the Gorham factory that he had known back in his days in Providence, Rhode Island. So they acquired the space at the Syndicate building downtown. They called it Bradstreet and Thurber Company. And he sold furniture. He was known for upholstering as well as all the high-end designs that he was doing. Sadly, this whole building was actually caught on fire in 1893, and Bradstreet lost everything, reportedly about $100,000 worth of investment, which in 1893 was considerable. And this was just the beginning of the big downfall and the collapse of the markets also in the 1890s. But that didn't deter him. So between his time that he came to Minneapolis in the 1870s and 1913, it's reported that he had traveled at least 7 trips over to the Orient. He also went to, like I said, to Europe, and he went to Bermuda several times. His last trip he took was in May of 1913. And knowing that kind of triggered something in my memory bank, and I went back and I looked at Frank Lloyd Wright's history, because it was at this time that Frank Lloyd Wright was actually heading to Japan to work on the designs for the Imperial Hotel. And I found that he had been coming back from Japan in May of 1913. So that prompted me to look at the passenger list for the same boat that actually Bradstreet was on, and found out that yes, indeed, Bradstreet, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Bernard Guggenheim were all on the same boat. As the trip probably took about a week, and they were all high society passengers, I'm sure they might have eaten dinner with the captain and had some exchanges. And knowing that, sadly, that Bradstreet died in 1914, had he lived longer, would he and Wright actually have teamed up and done some more extensive decorating and collaborating on different buildings that maybe Wright was looking into? Now, at the time he was going to Japan, I'll give you a little history here of what was happening. So Japan was actually closed to the West until 1853, when Admiral Perry had gone into Tokyo Harbor and they negotiated a treaty. And immediately his reports coming back of Japan and the wonders there began to attract tourists, especially after the Civil War, and especially after the modes of transportation really improved so that you could travel faster to the Orient by going by train to San Francisco or Vancouver. So this really attracted the upper crust who wanted to see things beyond Europe. And what happened in Japan at the time is that the artisans who were located normally out in the countryside saw an opportunity to capture obviously money and clients by actually moving into the major cities such as Yokohama, Kyoto, and Tokyo. And they set up markets where the tourists could actually get to very easily downtown. So they set up factories, and in order to please their employees, they actually brought in some of the things that they were familiar with from their background, which was the soothing garden settings that you would see outside their homes. And the gardens, they actually brought and mimicked those in the market centers next to their shops. Tourists saw this. They saw tea houses. They were given tea. There was water features, stone lanterns, a resting place while they could linger, and then obviously this encouraged them to buy more. So tourists loved this idea, and they wanted the same thing when they went at home. So they wanted to have the same feeling that was generated back home, not only where they were, but primarily in Minnesota, where Mr. Bradstreet was. What they didn't understand was that the westernized gardens that they built were based on what they saw, not what actually was based on why the gardens were set up the way they were with the ancient religious traditions and their philosophy. There are basically two types of Japanese gardens. Now, I'm in the process of learning about all of this myself, so I will share what little bit knowledge that I have to give you a feeling for where we are here in Minnesota. So basically, there's the dry Zen garden, and I know you've seen that, and I will have pictures here shortly. And there's also one that has water features. They imitate nature, showing heaven, earth, and man's place in relationship to the cosmos and between heaven and earth. In Japan, the formal gardens for pleasure actually began about 600 AD, when these were influenced by Buddhism being brought into Japan from China and Korea. And that whole philosophy of Buddhism influenced the people and influenced their housing and also the structures outside. It was mostly created by and for the wealthiest and the royalty because they had the land, they had the money and the time and the resources to invest in making their houses more comfortable. The earliest gardens represented islands and ponds and were close to the house so that you can actually look from the house to the garden as opposed to necessarily being within the garden. And again, they were based on the holistic view of the cosmos, in which man is an integral part of nature. Some elements in the traditional Japanese gardens include some of these things, but not all of these, and indeed even more. Rocks and boulders. Each one has a specific position and name in the garden, and they're placed in where they are for specific reasons. One could be the stone of worship, which is the best place to view the whole garden. The sentinel stone, which is an outlook along the water's edge from which you can view it. There's something called the wave receiving stone, which would usually be placed in water. And you know, when you watch water go around, it goes to the either side of a rock, but the wave washes upon the stone. So that's called the wave receiving stone. They had a seagull resting stone if you were near a beach location. Foliage is not what we usually think of as lots of flowers, but very simple shrubs and trees, sometimes blooming, and shrubs that actually would turn color in the fall. Water, be it ponds and streams. They had bridges which were natural and man-made, and then man-made features were added also. A resting shade, or what we call sometimes a tea house, lanterns, statues, and water basins. So on the left here is a typical dry bed or a Zen garden. And you'll see that the lines here represent water. And each stone is placed for a specific reason. It has meaning. Sometimes gardeners and owners would look for years to find the exact rock to say what they want to say in their garden. And for them, even making the lines in the garden is a meditative experience. On the right-hand side is a water garden, which is what we Americans think more of as a Japanese garden. It has more natural elements with rocks, bridges, shrubbery, some stone lanterns. So going back to the Judd house that Bradstreet first lived in when he came to Minneapolis, he had been influenced by the very first artisan gardens that he saw, which were very small and next to the buildings that he had. Because he was given free rein at the Judd house, he decided he's going to build a garden. And if you look at this picture, it is just jam-packed, and it's not really representative of a true Japanese garden. The boulders have no position. They're surrounding the pond. There happens to be, right here, there's a water feature coming out of the spout of maybe a dragon's mouth. We have the tea house or resting shade. There's some lanterns. I think this is a lady back here. We have another stone lantern, but it's all jam-packed into a very small space. But this was unique for Minneapolis, and tourists would come specifically on weekends to see this particular site. But eventually he was asked to remove it in 1905 because it became, if you can imagine what our Minnesota state bird is, it became a mosquito-infested place, and it was dirty and dusty most of the time and not well maintained. So he was asked to remove it before he left to go into his next point of business. Bradstreet, as Joellen had said, was really the most noted interior designer of his day in the Midwest. One of the houses that he did was this Gray Court home on Mount Curve, which is located, or was located, where presently the Unitarian Society is, across from Seven Pools. And the house was located on this side of Douglas, and then down here were all of his gardens, and going down to Hennepin Avenue. The interiors were just over the top. At this particular point in time, what was really popular, if you traveled to World's Fairs, was the influence of Morocco and Egypt, as they were discovering all kinds of things there. And so people brought that aesthetic back, and there's just layers and over-the-top rugs, and look at the ceiling effect up here. I don't know if I'd want to be the maid who would have to go up here and clean this periodically. And I'm sure that someplace in here is a hookah, which was also very common if you were going to be high society and showing the latest and greatest in interior design. But Bradstreet left the Judd house. He went to live a different place, but then in the meantime, his business had to find a new location after the fire. And in 1903, he was able to lease a building, which is a Renaissance Revival house, from the Reverend John Ferries, who was actually moving to Duluth, and he was going to begin going on missionary trips. And so the Ferries house, noted where the arrow is, was located right here at the intersection of 4th and 7th Avenue downtown. It took up quite a lot of the space here, so the house was on the corner, and then there was plenty of garden space for him to expand his garden on this side. Now by this time, Bradstreet has gone to the Orient many more times and was able to go further out into the areas and not stay in town. So he was able to get a better flavor of what the true Japanese garden meant to the people. And he was able to incorporate more of that design aesthetic into his garden. This building is now located on the site of where the Bradstreet Crafts House was at that point in time. This is one view of the Ferries house from the front. You can see it was built kind of in an Italian Renaissance style. And the picture on the left is how it was situated on the corner. So we have 7th and 4th, and we have this large house that he could turn into his shops. He could also have entertainment there and store all the things that he was bringing back from the Orient. I'm not sure that he actually lived here, but it is possible. Again, he was traveling so much that he could kind of hang his hat wherever. This is just the entrance to the house as he had it, and it was printed on a postcard. So he started building his Japanese garden in the gardens there of the Ferries house. And now we can see a more sophisticated touch to the gardens here. We do see the lanterns, we do see the water, we do see bridges that are incorporated here. And one of the things that Bradstreet did in his gardens that the Japanese did not do is he used concrete curbing to outline and set the tone for the space. You can see a little bit here in this particular picture. Another thing he did is he traveled to all the different exhibitions that were going on. And so he went to the 1876 exhibition in Philadelphia, the St. Louis exhibition, the World Fair, which was one of the first ones that Japan actually came to the United States and brought their traditions to show the people. And so this is, on the right-hand side, is the exhibit with the tea house, that they had. You can see there are some bronze cranes that are here. We have lanterns. And then you'll note this bridge is the same bridge that's over here. Bradstreet negotiated with the Japanese government to acquire that bridge. The bridge was built from ancient wood from a ship that had sunk near Japan. And in the garden, because it was new, Japan wanted to bring something very old that would give an air, a feeling of being old in the space. And Bradstreet really loved this particular bridge, and so he bought it from them and he installed it in his craft house garden. There was a professor in North Dakota State recently, in 1983, Ronald Ramsey, who described Bradstreet's garden this way. Indigenous Minnesota plants over the primary material was used in the crafts house garden. A bronze fountain, stone lantern, and century-old miniature pines were imported from Japan. And these, along with the plank bridge from the Japanese pavilion at the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904, contributed to the illusion of increased distance and great age, giving the crafts house a sense of isolation from the encroaching commercial district. I also know that Ronald Ramsey indicated that Bradstreet had designed 4 Japanese gardens on Lake Minnetonka. And up until last week, I can only find 3. But I did find, I think, the 4th one. Again, looking at the crafts house view, you can see the lovely bridge that he acquired, the stone concrete curbing, and the different lanterns that he would have used. And here's another garden view of Bradstreet himself sitting in his garden. And the caption says, "Flowers are probably the least important elements in the Japanese garden. Gnarled old pines, rocks, water, bridges, and above all, arrangement form the backdrop of the design." As I said, Bradstreet was known for his fabulous interior designs, which not that many exist, but he also was known for reinventing an ancient Japanese style, which was called Jindasugi. A woman named Sarah Seek did her thesis on this whole topic and the interiors of John Scott Bradstreet several years ago. This is a technique whereby wood, when it sits in water for centuries, eventually wears away the pith, but the grain of the wood stays upright and forms, based upon how the wood was laying in the water, different shapes. And the Japanese would take that and carve designs incorporating this ancient wood into the design. Bradstreet didn't want to wait a couple hundred years, so he figured out a way to enhance this and move this entire process along by just years instead. And the most notable way that you can see this, and some of you have, is to go to Mia, to the period rooms, where the Prindle House living room has been, if you want to call it, interred at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. This was the living room of the Prindle House, looking out onto Lake Superior. The house still does exist, but it's used as for public functions now. So this living room is actually just full of the Jindasugi type of woodwork. And if you please do go there if you haven't been recently and look at the period rooms. You can see this is a famous lotus table, which again uses the wood to tell the artist what to design, what animals to incorporate, what flowers. Most of Bradstreet's work right now, if you can find it, is going to sell in the 6 digits. So looking at this Prindle House is a pretty remarkable invention by Bradstreet that he's known for. He also, when he came back, gave lectures and lantern shows about his trips. This encouraged others to incorporate exotic designs in their spaces. He designed many interiors. He designed weddings, gardens, floral shows, in addition to all his interiors that he was working on. He even worked on the State Fair Design Committee in the 1880s for several years. And I know that he created at least 9 gardens in Minneapolis, but he influenced many more who couldn't afford to hire him. One of the first gardens that I found that he did was for the Reverend James Tuttle on Ferndale Road in 1901. He was a retired minister of I believe the Presbyterian Church, and he bought the Dean estate at Ferndale. And then he and his son together hired Bradstreet to overhaul and remodel it. The son, George, actually was a doctor in New York City, so he only came for the summertime. Sadly, Reverend Tuttle died in 1903, so he didn't get to enjoy the benefits very long of what Bradstreet did for him. And the house was sold in 1905 to James Stroud Bell, which is important because then Bell actually tore the house down and rebuilt his new house called Belford, but he did keep the gardens for a while. And the only picture I really have of the Stroud Bell garden is pictured here, which came off the MNHS, Minnesota Historical Society site at Belford Estate. The estate is still there, but the gardens have all been plowed under. So you can see the rustic Japanese bridge. You can see the outline of the curbing, some of the boulders in place, and the house is still located on Ferndale Road. Another house he did in Lake Minnetonka was at Point Lookout for George Christian residence. George Christian, this was his summer residence, but his winter residence you all probably know as the Hennepin History Museum. So he lived there in the wintertime and then had his summer residence. This is the only picture, again, I can find of this particular garden, and you can again see similarities. That we have the curbing, we have boulders, not normally greatly placed, and then because I know what to look for, you can see in this area we have the Japanese cranes here as well. I have no idea how big this garden was. I only have this picture of it. So if anyone has pictures or ideas where I can find them, I would really appreciate it. As I said, he influenced many other gardeners. One of those people who he influenced was Walter Ernest Bateman, who was a restaurateur and had the famous grill downtown Minneapolis. He was also an avid photographer and gardener. This was, the house is still located on 27th and Irving, but the gardens are no longer the way they are described here. It was such a wonderful garden that the Minneapolis Sunday Tribune took a full-page display on their Sunday paper outlining the different features of this garden. Looking at the picture on the left-hand side here, this is the back of the house, and we are standing as if we're down at Lake of the Owls Boulevard, looking up towards the Bateman house on Irving. We see a tea house. He also had a log cabin for some reason, and he built this like meandering stream that would have come from Irving heading down towards Lake of the Isles. Right now there is another house located, has been built in this location where the base of the stream would have been. Up towards Irving, and to the left side of the house, which would be the west side of the house, he had this type of a garden. Again, the Japanese influence with the boulders, the rocks, the water. We have a rustic bridge. We have probably some kind of a bamboo fencing, and a lady probably walking over another bridge. If you go to look at this house on Irving, the present owner is actually Eric Christ, who owns the Black Forest restaurant. And he has a different type of garden set up here, but it's in that same location as the former Japanese garden. The most documented, I guess, and advertised house that Bradstreet did was for John Burkholz, who was a wealthy banker. And I actually did a house history on this house several years ago, and I was asked by the owner, she had found underneath all the brush this concrete outlines, and she says, I want you to find me as many pictures of this garden because I want to restore it back to the way it was. So right now, in its present form, it's the only extant garden that Bradstreet had, and it's going to be even better when she finally restores it. The house was built by Walter Keith for the Burkholzes in 1904, and the garden followed suit after they had been to a trip to the Orient. This was actually from a postcard that I found in Minnetonka Historical Society, and you can see, again, the lanterns, the curbing, the bridge, the tea house in the background, and some of the islands. It was located in a space, the garden was, between the Burkholz's house and the next door house, which was owned by the Gregorys. You can see this is a picture looking at the Gregory house from the front piazza of the Burkholz house. There are actually 13 pictures that exist at Hennepin County Library of the interior of the house, which was designed by Bradstreet. And then I was able to contact a descendant of Eugenie Burkholz, who told me that she had 18 boxes of photographs and documentation that had not been seen in 100 years. She went through and she found me these fabulous garden pictures done by Paul Brooks, which was her grandfather. So Eugenie Burkholz was actually, her brother was Richard Andros, who married and had a daughter named Georgina, and Georgina married Anson Brooks. Anson Brooks was a wealthy man who was in the grain business, I believe it was, and he had a house at Minnetonka, and he had 2 houses on Park Avenue. And his son, Paul Brooks, was an avid amateur photographer and just had the best of the best equipment you can have in the 1900s. And they had a friend who was an actress in Minneapolis named Alice Moe, and he told her and asked her to please come out to the gardens. I want to photograph you. And to me, she looks like she would be Theda Bara, or she would be Lillian Gish, because she's dressed in these typical garments of the day. You can see her here on the rustic bridge. There's some other pictures here of her, again, with one of the bronze cranes. She's standing here on maybe the Sentinel Rock in the middle picture. I don't have a clue as to what these 2 objects are. This one looks more like it would have been imported from Asia. This to me looks like it's a dead tree stump and they put some flowers on top. But it would not normally, to my opinion, be in a Japanese garden, but it was taking advantage of the landscape. There's another picture of Alice here with the garden. What's helpful to the owner now is that she can use these pictures to restore the garden. In this particular picture on the left, you can see that Alice is walking across natural stones, or what appears to be natural stones, bridge in the water. And the picture on the right-hand side is showing Mrs. Burkholz in the middle, dressed in her Japanese garb at one of the many entertainment events that she loved to hold at her house in Minnetonka. Her niece, Georgiana Brooks, and then there was a lady friend of the Brookses. The Brookses also had 2 houses at Park Avenue. I believe both of them are standing. I know the second house they downsized to is now located at the corner of 26th and Park and is the funeral home. So that was actually a Brook residence before it became a funeral home. At that particular site, there is a Japanese, if you want to call it a tea house, that's there. It was built way after Bradstreet's death, so it was built in the 1920s, and is just presently used as an outbuilding by some gardens there. But if you drive by the funeral home, you will actually notice it. So the garden then shows what it should have looked like on the left-hand side, and presently, as the foliage was taken away from the garden, you could see the outlines of where the different features would have been. So the tea house on the left, you could see the water came right up to the tea house and was very, obviously, very present there. And presently here on the picture on the right is where all the greenery is where water would have been. And the tea house was about 6 by 8 feet in distance. And within the stones here are actually the footings of where the posts and pillars would have been to hold up the tea house. I know the tea house was still there at least through the 1930s when the Pomeroys bought the house. Another garden, this is the garden that I've recently discovered as of last week. And I found this photo on the left and just said water garden, and this was at the historical site. And I sent it to Minnetonka to some of my historical friends there, and I said, what is this house up here on the hill? And they all identified it as a house called Bonside, which was again built on Ferndale Road. And I thought, oh, this house the garden belongs to the Bonside house. But then I got another picture sent to me, and at the bottom it says the Bonside house across the Phelps pool, which means that the water garden actually is not on the Bonside property, it's on the Edmund Phelps property, which makes total sense because Edmund Phelps was the first partner for Bradstreet when he was in Minneapolis in the 1880s. So I guess the quest is now to find more photos of the Phelps garden. Bradstreet was so enamored with his city. He loved Minneapolis. He always loved coming back home. that he proposed that it should become a destination. And he felt that a good place for making a statement piece would be to go to Lake of the Isles, which was just being reopened. They were dredging the lake. They were digging the canal that was going to connect Bade-Makaska and Cedar Lake to Lake of the Isles. And he proposed that you take Raspberry Island and we make it into a Japanese garden that you could approach from the water. And this would be a memorable event that you could take your memories home with you and tell people about. So in a 1910 letter to the Minneapolis Park Board Commissioners, he proposed, "For several years, the possibilities of the islands have appealed to me with an increasing desire to add to their picturesqueness something of a personal nature. I should like to so treat the further of the two islands, which will be Raspberry Island, that from the shore it may with its pagoda, torii, and stone ishidori be remembered and talked about with pleasure by returned travelers." Like when we go to San Francisco and we talk about the San Francisco Japanese garden, he wanted people to talk about Minneapolis the same way. There would be a pagoda, traditional torii gate, stone lanterns, crabapple trees, lotus, and other flowering shrubs. And he was making this a gift to the city, to the park board, which they accepted because now they wouldn't have to pay for it. It sounded like a great idea at the time. And it was scheduled actually to be begun between 1912 and 1913, but it was never carried out. And it was probably due later to Bradstreet's death the following year in 1914. There was another garden at the time, George Partridge Garden, which was located, there was a huge house that Partridge built between Groveland Road and Douglas on Hennepin. And presently there's some office buildings there, and just south of there is now the Walker Museum. Described in the newspaper that day, it says, "A new departure, something more elaborate in the way of residential landscape architecture than anything yet attempted in this part of the country, is now being carried out by George Partridge on the grounds at the rear of his home on Groveland." Now, next to his house also was Edmund Walton's gardens. It was to be a Japanese garden, so perfect in every aspect that if Baron Kimura and his party should happen to drop in, they would feel that they were at home. He had a crew of men at work on the construction of the garden for the past 2 months, and considerable progress has been made. No expense is being spared to make the garden a gem of its kind, and the total cost is estimated at about $10,000. Now, in 1905, this would probably buy you 4 houses for $10,000, and he was spending it on the gardens. The garden will be laid out in an original way, though thoroughly Japanese in its general character, with artificial lake, winding walks, multicolored lanterns, rustic bridge, oriental arches, and 100 other forms of beauty. With strenuous rush and sternly practical business life in the Midwest would be a very restful place. I did find a newspaper, along with the article, there was this photograph, and it shows this pagoda, but I would say this is more of a pergola that was being designed in an English garden rather than a Japanese garden. And in order to make this garden, the T.B. Walker of the Walker estate, actually had this house that was only there for about 3 years in that same location as the garden. And Partridge had it moved in one night. It was raised up over time. And then it was moved from the bottom of Hennepin and Douglas across Lyndale and across Hennepin to probably someplace on the other side of Hennepin Methodist Church. And that was all moved in one night, and with cutting down the streetcar lines, etc. This is a lot of stone on the bottom and wood, and they had to actually hire a company from Chicago to come and move it. I don't know if this building still sits on the other side of Lyndale. I haven't looked that far at this point in time, but it had to be moved out of the way for a garden. So as I said, it was between Edmund Walton's house and his new house in Hennepin. There is a postcard here on the right that we're looking from the top of Douglas down towards Hennepin Methodist Church, and on the left, where you see these trees, is actually where the Partridge Garden was. And it was listed as a famous Japanese garden. Partridge's house existed till about 1936 when it was torn down to make a high-rise apartment there. I again, have been trying to look for other pictures of what this Japanese garden looked like, and so far, this is the only one that I've kind of come across. Though I did find two pictures here, one of Edmund Walton actually in his garden on the left-hand side, and then on this right-hand side, you could see this pergola, I think, looking down onto the Partridge Garden, and someplace in that location would be the Japanese gardens. Now, getting to Linden Hills, one of the most famous, and I guess the only famous garden of Bradstreet's that was built at the time, was that of Frank Fletcher. Frank Fletcher owned all the land. This is an overview of looking at 44th Street and Sheridan. And he owned 10 lots between here and this house over here. At the time, he built his house. William Kenyon designed a house for him in 1900 that he had here. And he had his Japanese gardens back here along the streetcar right-of-way, which right now the Great Harvest Bakery is located here. And this is the streetcar right-of-way. St. Thomas Catholic Church had a small church, which is now, I believe, the Quaker meeting house further down 44th. And he sold all his lot to St. Thomas for $50,000 to build their new church and grounds. And he also donated the house to be used as a parsonage. Well, the parsonage was used until about the 1940s, and then it was torn down because they wanted to expand the school and a parking lot. And they had no one who wanted to maintain the Japanese gardens. So the Japanese gardens, which were located in this area, have been bulldozed under, I guess, with whatever was left from the building supplies of the church. The only known picture I could find of Frank Fletcher is actually him here with his wife, Odalie, who was Swiss-born, himself, and Mrs. Rawson, who are dressed up in Japanese apparel. Mr. Fletcher had quite a collection of Japanese etchings, watercolors. He was also on the board of directors of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, focusing on the Asian studies. And whenever he could, he collected these Japanese woodblocks, prints, and then he would display them at the beard galleries. He would, with his wife, would dress themselves up in Japanese attire and then come and present his show and talk about the wonderful pictures that he had. He did donate some of them to Mia, but the others, I guess he had a falling out with Mia at some point in time prior to his death, and a lot of them were sold out east at different galleries. The only pictures I have so far were in the newspaper and also in an article that he himself wrote for the Minnesota Horticulturist. So on the left is the one from the newspaper, which says it's a wonderful little Japanese garden transplanted from Nippon to the Minneapolis home of Frank Fletcher. And again, it shows the tea house, it shows the Ishidori lanterns, etc. And we know that Bradstreet helped him design it. We also know that there was a Japanese painter who was a teacher at Mia of watercolors. His name was Yamato Basaki, and he also helped with the design of the garden. So the water garden, as Fletcher wrote in the Hort Society photograph article, was, "To the Japanese, his garden is a picture impressionistic upon which he lavishes a wealth of material and study to reproduce some actual or imaginary landscape. He reproduces it as if it were in miniature, a garden picture of mountain, field, and stream. All this is done by skillful and artistic arrangement of rock masses, trees, flowers, and water. With a pond or pool as a nucleus to build around, the Japanese simulates the irregular projections, bays, inlets, and the stony margin of a lake shore. A diminutive bridge to a small island furnishes the necessary touch of space and distance, and a 10-foot hillock planted with small or dwarfed trees makes a background and lends contrast. Stone and iron lanterns, bronze animals and birds, stone water basins, and pagodas are found in appropriate places whereby some feature of the garden may be accentuated, all the result of careful thought and study." The picture on the left is the only picture I found so far of the Kenyon residence, and this is actually found in your book, your Linden Hills book down at the lake. And in the picture, I don't know where the picture came from, but I'm sorry that in order to blow it up, it looks a little pixelated here. But this was a house designed by Kenyon, and you can see the early garden that he had in 1902. But by 1913, he really expanded into his Japanese garden, again with the features that I've outlined before. And I think there is a lady right here pictured standing on the bridge with her little umbrella. One more view says it's of the island, and in the middle of the island here we have a Buddha, and we have significant boulders, and there's other bridges, etc. We don't know the extent of the size of the garden. I'm hoping to get into the archives of St. Thomas and see if they have any further photos that they might have stored away of what would have been their parsonage at the time when they were given this house to renovate and to keep. Influenced also at the time as other houses were being built. This is a house on Lowry Hill at 18th and Girard, and it was built by George Thompson, who hired Bradstreet to do the interiors. This has now been broken up into three, it's this house here on the right, it's been broken into three condos. The lower one is where the living room and library is, that also has Jindasugi artwork and carvings above the fireplace. Whether this gate is original or not, to me it's just a wonderful rendition of a Japanese gate and entrance into a garden. There is a garden behind here that's square, and it's outlined in brick with grass in the center. And in the center of the grass is actually this water fountain. I have met with a homeowner of the one condo, and I keep asking if we can maybe explore to see if there might be once upon a time water underneath there. And we haven't actually gone there because she was trying to sell her condo. But just a wonderful Japanese influence, again, within Lowry Hill itself. Hopefully, because Bradstreet did the interiors, he also influenced the garden. Now, what Japanese gardens are left today? The only one we know about for Bradstreet is actually the one out in Arcola Lane in Minnetonka Beach, But you can find one at Normandale College, has a beautiful one in Bloomington. If you go up to Duluth, you can go to the Enger Tower Park and Japanese Garden. You can go to Northville to the Joe Rio N. Dry Garden at Carleton College, which was deemed one of the top 10 dry gardens in the United States just a few years ago. Recently, the Ordway family has donated funds to restore the Como Park Gardens. They are absolutely gorgeous. And I haven't been over there, and the photos I tried to copy for this presentation wouldn't let me download them. Just a wonderful, remarkable garden. And of course, right here in our neighborhood, we have the Lindale Park Peace Garden at Lake Harriet, which has some elements of Japanese garden, including their bridges. This is the Normandale College with some of its bridges, and you can just see the corner of the tea house. It is open to the public. I'm not sure if you just park in the parking lot, and I'm not sure if you have to make any reservation to go there presently or not. But it's off of France Avenue and at Normandale College. Originally, Como Conservatory didn't hesitate to do a Japanese garden. This is from a postcard on the left where they've brought in some elements of the lanterns, and they have a bridge access and walkability and a hillside. An earlier black and white photo of the same spot shows some people there on the bridge. And again, this went into decay through most of the 20th century, and with the Ordway funds now having restored the garden, it's wonderful. I would highly encourage anybody to go over there. And of course, the Lindale Peace Garden has its own little Japanese elements here with the wonderful little bridge and some stoneware and some rocks and beautiful foliage that is available all times of the year. You can always see weddings and baptisms being held in the garden, and that's right here in our own neighborhood. So in summary, Frank Fletcher himself wrote in 1911, "While the religious significance in such garden adaptations is naturally lost to us, much of the charm of its symbolism remains. To the Japanese, the angle and line of each boulder and bank, the curve and color of tree and blossom have a meaning, the inheritance of tradition. While we cannot approximate the craftsmanship of him reared under the shadow of a Buddha, we can absorb such parts of his craft as we can understand and appreciate, and in doing so, increase our perception of the nature of beauty about us. John Scott Bradstreet died August 10th of 1914. He actually died after several weeks of illness, at which he was expected to recover, but he didn't. At the time, he was staying in the Ferndale home of one of his friends, Mr. and Mrs. Morris Hallowell. His service was held at Plymouth Congregational Church. He's interred at Lakewood. And on his stone, there's a plaque. At the bottom of the plaque, it says, "To the land of the unreturning." His honorary pallbearers included William Channing Whitney, the architect, Edmund Phelps, his longtime partner, and Dr. William Falwell of the University of Minnesota. Most of his art treasures were supposed to be donated to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, but when the will was read, it actually went to two of his sisters and his nieces, and they in turn donated some artwork to Mia, but kept most of it and took it back east. So his remnants and his legacy still lives here. We're hoping to restore one of those gardens, the one in Minnetonka Beach, back to represent what he actually had to say about his gardens. Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you so much. Appreciate it and the opportunity. Now we're going to open it up, I guess, to questions.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to contribute?
I have a question about some pictures that appeared in Craftsman magazine. I was wondering if she can identify what that it says Crafts House, so I assume it's Judd House that you're speaking of there.
I know that there were magazine articles written at that time period, which featured a lot of his close-ups of the garden. I have those photos, and you're probably actually looking at those. We can't see from what you're doing there.
You can't see it very well enough. You sometime in person.
Yes, but those do appear to be the Crafts House garden, yes. And if you notice, I put in the chat that I misspoke and that the Fletcher gardens are at 44th and Upton, not at 44th and Sheridan. My apologies for that one.
We accept that. We think half the world is a little confused on Upton and Sheridan, right? That block.
I also had a comment that after he left the Judd House in 1905, as Phil, I think, wrote in the chat, he did go live at the Plaza Hotel, which was located in that confluence of Lyndale and Hennepin, where the tunnel is now. So he did live at the Plaza from 1905 until his death in 1905.
Susie, you must be quite familiar with Japanese gardens. Did some of Kathy's descriptions and stuff ring true for you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
It was fascinating. I enjoyed it so much. And I want to say that before the Imperial Hotel was torn down, the Imperial Hotel that was made by Frank Lloyd Wright in Tokyo, I was in it several times because I lived in Japan basically from 1964 until 1990. And
Wow.
I have visited some of the most beautiful traditional Japanese gardens and temples in Kyoto way back in the 60s. But I wanted to also say that if anyone is interested in creating a Japanese garden, later, maybe for you, Joellen, I will send the title of one or two books about Japanese gardens. I think there's a book, it's maybe called A Touch of the Japanese Garden, for Westerners. But anyway, it was so fun today to hear all that information.
Oh, good. Thank you. I hope I captured the essence. And I'm kind of disappointed we don't have more Japanese gardens. Maybe they're out there. We just don't know where they are. They're in everybody's backyard. But I know I'm intrigued and I want to do one.
I thought it was so interesting to hear about, the rocks having names and certain locations, and I thought that was quite enlightening. I was not familiar with that.
Um, I'm wondering how the Japanese gardens were able to withstand our typical Minnesota winters.
Well, they did pick Minnesota, they did adapt it to the Minnesota type of plants. So where he would import several plants to be used in the garden, he would use the ones that obviously that we're familiar with would be certain pine trees, which in plants. And because he wasn't incorporating flowers, you could have miniature shrubs that would simulate that. So the only thing I worried about is I have koi in my garden, and you have to take them out in the wintertime because my pond is not very deep. And I don't know if any of his gardens actually had fish. I did see one kind of floating around in one of an up close picture, but you would have to take them out. Otherwise they would probably die unless you heated the water, which I don't think they did back in the early 1900s.
Kathy,
Who's that?
Bob Clancy.
Yes, sir.
Side story about the house that got moved across
Oh,
the
yes.
bottleneck
You
in the
do
middle
have-
of the night.
Yes, you do have more information about that. Thank you.
The house was owned by Thomas Lowry at the time. I'm sorry, Walker.
Thomas
not
Walker.
Thomas. T.B. Walker. And he bought it, or he donated it to the Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church with the idea that it become their parsonage. Curiously, he moved it across the street to their land 4 years before the church began construction. And the house never did become the parsonage. It was torn down in 1939. And there are some photos of it, which I'll be sending to you.
I thought it was interesting when I read how they were actually moving that house because it was so heavy that they brought in truckloads. I think it was 10 carloads of timber from Chicago, and they jacked it up. And then they had a team of 4 horses that would pull that across from Douglas to over to Lindale.
It was
I wish I had pictures. That would be a
the house-
remarkable sight.
The house had a stone exterior, so it probably was pretty heavy.
Mhm. But house moving was very common at this time. I have also created a spreadsheet of moving permits, and it's got thousands of buildings that were moved. It was the way of recycling what we already had and reusing and repurposing. Garages became houses and accessory dwelling units, etc. So it was very, very common to move things. Today it'd be so expensive that nobody is definitely not doing it. Though I do think, Joellen, you said there was a house moved on your corner recently on Thomas that's now for sale in Linden Hills.
Yeah.
So it does still occur as long as you don't go very far.
But the house that you and Bob are talking about, that was really a big house with like we're saying, with all the stone. I mean, that was very impressive.
Do you remember several years ago in St. Paul, at the bottom of the History Center, there was a big house that was in the middle of the intersection across from the Energy Center.
Excel Energy, yeah, the hockey rink, yeah.
Yes, and they moved that,
So.
and I did see that, a little bit of that sometime, but it was very slow.
Yeah.
I think it now exists down near Rice Park. But that
Of course,
was
not to get too distracted, but I can't help talking about the Schubert, the one that was moved downtown. I worked downtown, so every day I saw it inching down the street. It was fabulous to watch. But anyway, we're distracted here. So.
So I'm still in the process of learning more and more and discovering more photographs. And now that COVID is kind of ending, I'm hoping to get into some of these archives and start looking in depth and acquiring more photographs if I can. So I can tell more of the story.
I just got an email from Special Collections. Some of you may have gotten that too, saying that they now are open. So you can go in and actually do your own research. So like down at Normandale with their gardens, you mentioned that you're not quite sure if you have to make arrangements to tour it. Does anybody know, a place that you could go that will give you a tour of and more orientation to the Japanese gardens?
I was just going to Google it and see what the story is, but
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah.
I was going to say something related to the Normandale Garden, the Japanese garden, that a couple years ago, they had an anniversary of the Normandale College. And at the same time, they had a celebration of some aspects of Japanese culture here in Minnesota. So they had Japanese dance in the garden, and maybe some songs and some traditional Japanese instruments. And it was really fun to go to. And I believe that I think someone should call the Normandale College. I think maybe it's open to the public at any time, I believe.
Yeah. How about the Como Park Japanese garden?
Can I say something about that too?
Yes, please.
Please do.
So I think every year, perhaps they have a big celebration, or not celebration, but anniversary for the bombing of Nagasaki. And I think it's related to the garden, the Japanese garden at Como Park. And I have been to that. And that's quite very fantastic, very large event. And they'll have many booths. And they'll be selling some Japanese things from Japan. And what's also unique is the one part this is really not the part of the Japanese garden, but there's another part that has a kind of like a moat, shall we say, or looks like a river, and they're floating lanterns, which is something that sometimes is done in Japan. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful event to go to. So if you look, so I think sometime early August is for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I believe St. Paul and maybe Nagasaki are sister cities, and that's why they have it at the Japanese garden in Como Park.
The garden.
My question is, the woman who is speaking today, what got you so interested in Bradstreet and his interest in Japanese gardens?
It goes back to when I was doing the house history on Arcola Lane, and the primary focus of being hired was she had discovered these outlines of the garden, and she wanted me to find photographs so she could restore it. And that just led to another one and another, those tentacles of research just keep reaching out, and you have to go solve them. So we're still finding more photographs, and I do have more for her. So the goal for her is to restore it and put it on the National Register. So we will actually have a Bradstreet Japanese garden in reality. So that'd be fun.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you.
The Japanese garden at Carlton is not to be missed. It's quite beautiful, has a tea house, and it's one of those dry gardens, as Kathy said. I was on a tour of it about 2-3 years ago. That was organized by Barbara Evans, who is my fellow member of the Minnesota Society of Architectural Historians chapter. And she's on the HPC in Northfield, and really knows Northfield a lot. And I think she would welcome any inquiry about touring, not just the Japanese garden, but there's a lot to see in Northfield, of course, architecturally speaking.
I think, David, did you want to mention the MIA exhibit back in, 10 years ago or whatever?
Actually, I think it was 1994. Minnesota, 1900 was, and there's a book, Art and Life on the Upper Mississippi, 1890 to 1915. There's a chapter about Bradstreet and the Craft House, and some of the pictures that Kathy showed us tonight are there. And there's a picture of Bradstreet in the Japanese garden with Sam Trubshaw. I don't believe we saw that one tonight.
I did not put that in there, but I have seen that one.
Maybe we did. But anyhow, there's quite a bit about Bradstreet, or there's a chapter about Bradstreet in that exhibit, Minnesota 19.
And that was the book by Michael Conforti, who was the director.
Yes, that's correct.
Michael
And-
Conforti hired me to edit 2 of the essays in that book.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you all for participating and being with us. It's been another good evening. So, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kathy.
Good night.